Before you start this video, you should have already explored the formatting options in R Markdown, and you should have installed LaTeX so we can knit this document into PDF. Now we can move what we did in the census script into our R Markdown file so we can show our workflow with the census API and census data mapping in R Markdown. I already have a few lines here describing the purpose of this document. Now, next thing we need to do is to insert a code check. There are a few ways of doing this. You can directly type the 3 backticks and 3 more, that's a code check. But currently it's not going to be evaluated because we don't have a header. We have to put a header here indicating the language it's using, which is R by default. And you see when I put that into the header, these buttons appeared, meaning now you can run the code. Another way is to use the insert menu here. So by default that inserts an R code check, but there are also these languages you can choose from, like Python, and the language you use will be in the header. Okay. The third way, and it's probably the way you should use, is to use the keyboard shortcut. The combination Control-Alt and I inserts an R code check. Okay, you might notice that there's a chunk 1 here, which is our first code chunk, and this is a navigator that helps you quickly navigate to different parts of your document. It can be very useful, especially when your document gets long. So it's also helpful if instead of chunk 1, chunk 2, we give it a name. It's also good practice to do just one thing with each code chunk. So it's easier to name it, it's easier to find your code, easier for debugging. It's called the first code chunk setup. Setup is kind of a special code chunk. Typically we have just one of those in the beginning of a document. I'm going to use this code chunk for loading packages. And maybe also set my census API key. But again, remember you have to replace this your API key to the real key, and I'm gonna make it a comment here because this line will not run besides I already installed my API key. Okay, with the second code block, I'm gonna read some ACS data. So call it I can run this code block here, and you see the data is read into the environment, and I also run the first code chunk setup because that's the first thing you need to do with the R Markdown, and it's automatically run just once in the beginning of the document. The problem is, we can't see it now, but if I knit it to HTML, these are our code chunks, and there's a lot of nonsense information displayed in our R Markdown output document, and certainly we don't need this, and we don't really need these either. So one thing we can do is to either hide the code block itself or to hide its output. And there are different types of outputs, like results when you're presenting a table, the results of a calculation. There are messages and there are warnings. Warnings when you have an error or something. So we can set a code block to not display any of these things, including the code block itself. And that would be the option. So we can set some code chunk option here. There are some simple output options: show output only, show code and output, show nothing, but still run code, and show nothing and don't run code. So if we choose show nothing, that will add this line into our header, which is also where you set your code chunk settings, include equals false. So that means this code chunk will not be included in the output document, but the code will still run. If we change it to show output only, it will be echo equals false. So we'll still see the output. In this case, it's pretty useless, but we will not see the code chunk itself. There are also more chunk options. You can click this link to check more options. So if you do the same thing with the setup chunk, say show nothing, which we know is include equals false, but why is it adding a new line of code here? Again, this is something specific to the setup chunk. So this line is called global options. And using this, you can set global options for all the code chunks in your document, unless you specify otherwise. So if I set something like, so we already have include equals false here. If I set include equals true here, that will apply to all the code chunks in the document other than like this, because I specifically said I don't want to include this in my output. So you can override global options, but it can also be helpful if you want to set a certain option for a large number of code chunks. So there are some other options you can use, like message. That will suppress the message output, and warning. It might be a little dangerous to put these, like especially suppressing warnings as a global option, because sometimes you do need to see those messages or warnings to figure out something is wrong with your code. So maybe you can include this at the end of your workflow producing your final output, but it's not recommended to set it as a global setting otherwise. But I am gonna suppress results. So that will hide the results. Messages. Okay. The next code block, I'm gonna produce a map. I have to remove a few layers here because I haven't created city Chambly datasets yet. And I can run this code chunk to print a map into the document. Alright, I also already installed LaTeX, so I can now knit to PDF. Cool. Now you can see we have the code chunks when we choose to display them and the results that we want to display into the same PDF document. Here I'm only focusing on code chunks, but make sure you also include necessary text explanations before or after code chunks, and keep using the formatting options to produce a neat report.